When building a high horsepower Falcon, it's usually not that hard to get big numbers out of the barra. The hard part is actually getting the driveline strong enough to be able to handle those big numbers. So for decades, Falcon owners have used a variety of different options, from the Powerglide and the Turbo 400 to the T56 and TR6060, and more recently, the ZF6 and then 6R80 builds on top of that. But recently, there's been a paradigm shift, with all of these gearboxes becoming old news, with the newest, latest, greatest gearbox swap taking over the automotive world. I am of course talking about the ZF8. The ZF8 is the younger, stronger brother of the ZF6, typically found in newer BMW, Audis, and even some Maseratis. But why am I making bold predictions about some gearbox used in BMWs and Audis becoming the go-to option for high horsepower Falcon builds? Well, my friends, it's because of the insane numbers that these boxes can handle from stock and how much faster they make any car that they're put in. You're probably already familiar with the ZF6 and some of the variations that they came in the Ford Falcons, as well as sort of the numbers that they can handle. There's the 6HP26 in both NA and turbo variants in the Falcons, and from factory, they're rated to handle 260 Newton meters of torque. However, it's pretty common to find unmodified ZF6s handling 600 to 800 Newton meters-ish out in the wild in various Falcon turbo builds, usually the 4 to 600 horsepower range. The 6HP21 was found in some FG Mark II and FGX models, and this one handles a whole lot less with only 210 Newton meters from factory, but people have found that they've broken them even with NA Falcons. There's a few variations of how people try to build and make these gearboxes handle more power, from adding extra clutches to changing input shafts and sometimes even intermediary shafts. However, the big dog of the ZF build world is the 6R80. Basically, the 6R80 is Ford's version of the ZF6 on steroids. It's beefed up, stronger, bigger, better to be able to handle the weight and the high torque of American trucks. Because they're basically just better versions of the ZF6, it's relatively easy to take all the parts from them and shove them inside a ZF6 and then be able to put that straight back in the Falcon. The downside of the 6R80 build, however, is the cost. They range from $6,000 to $16,000. We don't have time to go into what the difference between those two is today, but trust me, the $16,000 build is a lot different to the $6,000 build. This is the big downside of the ZF6. To be able to make it handle big power, you've got to spend big money. And this is where the ZF8 immediately blows it out of the water. The power that these things can handle from factory is insane. The variants of the ZF8 that you'll typically find in gearbox swaps are the 8HP45, the 8HP55, the 8HP70, the 8HP75, and the 8HP90. As the name suggests, these boxes are rated from factory to handle anywhere between 450 Newton meters up to 900 Newton meters. These boxes are capable of handling just an insane amount of power without having to do anything to beef them up. And they've got a whole bunch of technological and engineering advantages to them that just make them blow everything else out of the water. To be able to handle all that power, they've got a massive input shaft, they've got a very high spline count. Basically, bigger means handling more power. The physical design of the ZF8 is also superior in a lot of ways. They use very few moving parts, which makes them faster, lighter, and more reliable. And this gives them a performance advantage not just in sequential shifting, 1, 2, 3, 4, but also in irregular shifting, hopping gears or skipping gears to get the car into the peak power band. They are very well designed in a way that they can quickly and safely be able to jump from second to fourth or seventh back down to fifth to be able to get the car back into that power band that it needs to be to perform as perfectly as possible. Speaking of power bands, having 8 gears is going to be a lot better for peak performance than having 6 or 5 or 3, like some of the current options that people use. This will help the car get to peak power faster and then keep it there, because having more gears means you can stay in that power band a lot longer. Ultimately, This means that you're going to go a lot faster than the guy who's only got 3 gears to work with. ZF8 has a lock-up torque converter design. It's not the same as DCT, but you could actually argue that it's better in a lot of ways because it's lighter and can be more easily modified to handle more power. This lock-up clutch design means that you can put a clutch pedal in your car, hook it up to a button, and send a signal to the gearbox, basically telling it to lock and unlock as though it were a manual clutch. For all intents and purposes, it's basically a manual mode. You are getting your automatic gearbox as close to being a manual gearbox as you possibly can. It's even possible to set up your pedal throw and feedback in a way that tells the gearbox to lock and unlock the clutch more progressively, giving you finer control like you would have in a manual gearbox. But Josh, if these gearboxes are so great, why haven't I heard of them before? How come I haven't seen anyone using them yet? That's a good question, my friend. Let me explain. As I mentioned, until very recently, you couldn't just grab a 1000 horsepower capable ZF8, slap it in a Ford Falcon and call it a day. It just wouldn't work. If you've watched any of my videos about doing the ZF swapping in my Falcon from 5-speed to the ZF or from the NA to the turbo variant, you probably already guessed why you can't just grab a ZF8 and throw it in the Falcon that came with the ZF6. It's all about the transmission control unit. This nifty little computer inside your gearbox takes and receives data from the ECU, telling the gearbox when to change and what to do, and sending signals back to the ECU so it understands what the gearbox is doing. And every ZF TCU comes with a serial number, and that serial number is matched against the ECU of the car that that gearbox is installed in. This is why you can't just take a ZF6 out of one Falcon and put it in another Falcon and have it just work. There's always some extra steps to that process. And even if we ignore all the serial number matching nonsense for a minute, this is a totally new gearbox. It has different software, different architecture, different ways of doing things. You can't just take a BMW gearbox and put it in a non-BMW car and expect the ECU and TCU to be able to talk to each other. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to somehow make the TCU software talk to your ECU software. And then when they're able to talk to each other, they have to be able to send and receive data between each other and interpret it in a way that's actually useful, and they can each do their respective jobs with the data that they're given. And then on top of all that, all the software is probably encoded, it's probably protected, it's got intellectual property rights that the ZF own, that BMW own. It's just an absolute nightmare to try and get these things to work in any other car. Basically, it's all just very, very, very hard. And that made a lot of people, for a long time, think that it would never be done. Because of course, the car community, with its special mechanical engineering car-obsessed brand of autism, was totally going to look at the best gearbox in the world ever made, a 1000 horsepower engine that they'd built, and go, it's very hard to put these two together. I just give up. For those of us who knew that this problem would be solved in due time, the writing was on the wall. This was going to be the next big thing. In fact, yours truly got in touch with a certain Aussie-based ECU manufacturer a few years ago to ask them if they were working on software support in their ECUs for the ZF8 and the Ford 10R80 gearboxes, just like they had created support for the ZF6 gearboxes. They emailed back and said that it would never be done, that it was very hard to do, and so why bother? They hadn't had any of their Falcon customers ask if they could make a ZF8 work in their Falcon yet, so why would they even try? I've recently heard through the grapevine that that same Aussie ECU manufacturer is now desperately scrambling to try and get native ZF8 support working on their ECUs, because they're losing customers to foreign competition who have already got support for it. So let's talk about what were the solutions to getting the ZF8 to work in cars that it wasn't supposed to be in. Companies like HTG and CanTCU have created control units that interrupt the signal between the TCU and the ECU and basically work as an intermediary, interrupting and interpreting the data and sending it back and forth in a way that both the ECU and the TCU can understand and helps control the both of them without them ever being aware that the wrong gearbox is married with the wrong ECU. With a solution like this, you retain the factory TCU, along with all of its safety features and the sheer scale of the engineering work that went into making them the best possible way to control a ZF8. The downside of this is that now you've got 3 computers, all talking back and forth with each other, all having some room for error, some room for user error. In fact, HTG, while being full of features and very capable, is also notorious for being incredibly difficult to set up. Sometimes to the point where even professionals at workshops just can never get it right and will end up giving up and going with a different option because it's just too hard for them to work out. The next solution looks at all the problems around the TCU and basically asks, what if we just got rid of that? This is where the turbo lamech comes in. In this option, you actually open up your gearbox, literally remove the TCU from it, and install what is essentially a dummy unit in its place. Then the turbo lamech controller can be plugged into your gearbox, and it controls it as the TCU now. These units come with quite a lot of advantages for user friendliness, aside from the whole having to cut the TCU out and solder a dummy thing in, which is something people mess up quite a lot, but the controller itself is very capable. In fact, it has self-learning capabilities, meaning that you don't have to go through as much work to be able to tune the gearbox in the car to get everything talking together nicely and operating properly. And then finally, the cream of the crop, the ultimate goal that haters said would never be possible: direct native support with the ECU. This is where Max ECU come in. Already a well-known ECU brand, they've developed native support for the ZF8HP70 gearbox. They've also got a bunch of extra features like trans brake, like shift emulation, and customizable shift points. The downside of this option is that currently they only support the 8HP70 gearbox. All of the other options I've mentioned already can work with basically any gearbox that you've got. They do claim that they're working on other gearbox options, but we'll have to wait and see whether that actually pans out. This solution is the most cost-effective and straightforward of all of the solutions, and I believe it's one of the big reasons that ZF8 swapping is about to take off and become the next commonplace big horsepower build gearbox swap that everyone is going to want to have. Depending on which one of these solutions you go with, as well as who you go to for labor and tuning, the total cost of a ZF8 build can vary by quite a bit. But let's do a quick rundown to just give an example of how cost-effective ZF8 swapping actually is. You can pick up a second-hand 8HP70 for between $3,000 and $5,000. The control unit will set you back between $2,000 and $3,000 depending on which option you go with. The wiring harness will depend on which controller option you go with, and this will vary between $500 and $1,000. An adapter to marry the ZF8 to the Barra will range anywhere between $500 and $2,500, but I have seen that this area is going to have a lot of competition very soon because there's a few companies already working on their own billet forged adapter options that they plan to mass produce and release to the market for a very low cost. So keep an eye on that space because that $2,500 is probably going to come down a heck of a lot once there's a bit more competition in that portion of the market. Shifter options can vary quite a bit depending on which controller you've gone with. Some of them will allow you to just use your car's factory shifter, while others will either require a BMW shifter, which is about $200, or you could even go for the DCT shifter if that's what you want, which could set you back up to $1,300. And then you'll need a new tail shaft to actually get all that power from your gearbox to your wheels. This again can vary quite a bit, so let's just say anywhere between $800 and $3,000 for a little bit of clarity. So some napkin math tells us that in parts alone, this build can vary from about $6,000 to $15,000, depending on which path you've gone down. Then there's the cost of labor, which could basically be free if you're capable and you do the job yourself, or it could cost you an astronomical amount of money if you end up going to the wrong workshop. However, at the time of writing, there are already workshops specializing in this swap that can do the full conversion, drive in, drive out, for about $10,000, all the parts provided by them. So if we compare these costs of doing an 8-speed swap versus the current options that people are using for high horsepower builds, the 8 swap, even at its most expensive, is still a better option. As I mentioned earlier, doing 6R80 builds is anywhere between $6,000 and $16,000, depending on to what extent you go to and who you go to for that build. Turbo 400s tend to range in the same price range as well. No matter what option you look at that's currently available, none of them come close because whilst the cost might be similar depending on what direction you go with, none of them have the performance to match the ZF8. With all of the recent developments that have happened with ZF 8-speed swaps, this is going to become the next big thing for everyone that has high horsepower builds, anyone who's trying to achieve the fastest road registered quarter mile time, or if you've just got enough coin to spend and want to build the most bulletproof driveline. This will become the go-to for everyone. Watch, over the next 12 to 24 months, everyone will be swapping to ZF8s, and they'll be bragging about how amazing the ZF8 is. I'm calling it now. We're about to see a massive change in the gearboxes that everyone is using. Power Glides, Turbo 400s, even the ZF6 are all old news. They are dead in the water because the 8-speed is here to take over.